a gentle drift through parlors and greenhouses of the Victorian era, where women in layered skirts nurture ferns the size of umbrellas, and occasionally their quiet rivalries. It begins in the hush of a drawing room, the kind of quiet where even the grandfather clock seems to take long, lazy breaths between ticks. You're standing near the tall, lace-draped window, watching a curl of morning fog dissolve over the garden. The air smells faintly of damp soil and coal smoke, the two great perfumes of the age. Outside, beyond the hedges, the street is empty except for a milkman who looks like he's been up since the reign of George III. You probably won't make it through this day. But before we go further, if you're enjoying this slow ramble into history, I'd be quietly delighted if you liked this video and subscribed for more. No bells or whistles, just a promise that we'll keep this pace and let the days meander. And in the spirit of community, leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is right now. I imagine you curled somewhere comfortable, maybe with tea cooling at your elbow. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You walk toward the conservatory at the back of the house, skirt swishing, or perhaps, if you're imagining yourself in simpler attire, just the soft shuffle of slippers. The glass panes are fogged over from the night's rain, catching the light in a dreamy blur. And inside, there they are, rows and rows of ferns. Some are demure little things in clay pots. Others sprawl like they're auditioning for the role of tropical understudy to a tree. The year is somewhere in the late 1870s. This is the height of pteridamania, the fern craze. Yes, this was a real thing. The Victorians had a knack for turning simple pleasures into social competitions, and women's fern growing was no exception. The most dedicated cultivated fronds that could unfurl longer than a dinner fork, and the proudest displayed them as if they were children, sometimes naming them, because nothing says, "I have both leisure and strong opinions," quite like naming a fern Geraldine. You lean closer to inspect one. The fine green lace of its leaves is beaded with dew, so perfect you could almost imagine it was embroidered. Your hostess, Mrs. Winifred Talbot, approaches from behind with the gentle determination of someone about to lecture you on root health. She wears a deep plum dress, a shade chosen perhaps to remind you she can afford imported dyes. "Water only when the air feels dry enough to crackle," she says softly, as though she's revealing a state secret. "And never, never overhandle the fronds. They resent it." A fact for you. In 1860, fern motifs were so popular that manufacturers printed them on everything from wallpaper to teacups. Whole parlors became shrines to the delicate silhouette of a frond. And yet, historians still debate whether the craze was driven more by genuine botanical passion or by the quiet thrill of besting one's neighbors. As you step around the conservatory, you notice one particularly large specimen in the corner, its pot ornate, its soil fresh. A whisper of rivalry seems to cling to it, as though the plant knows it's the reigning champion of this year's informal competition. Winifred pats it like one might pat a prized greyhound. She mentions, almost casually, that Lady Cartwright's fern had an unfortunate accident with overpruning. You're not sure if you're supposed to respond with sympathy or congratulations. You wander back toward the house, the faint echo of rain tapping the glass overhead. Remember the street you walked past earlier? It's back. Now with a cart rumbling over cobblestones, the sound softened as though muffled under blankets. You pause in the doorway, feeling the warmth of the house settle into your shoulders. Somewhere, far in the kitchen, a kettle sighs. You find yourself in the morning room, a smaller, sunnier chamber lined with shelves of books that smell faintly of dust and lavender polish. The furniture is arranged as though someone cared very deeply about conversation but also about not getting too close. A tea tray rests on a low table, the steam curling like sleepy punctuation. Mrs. Talbot settles into a chair and begins recounting the great Fern show of '74. You didn't know such a thing existed, but apparently, it was held in the town hall, and people traveled from villages miles away to marvel at the finest fronds in the county. Imagine a farmer's market, but instead of carrots and jam, it's pots of greenery being appraised by men with elaborate whiskers. A small cultural tidbit. Some Victorian women kept fern albums, pressing and cataloging specimens with the same pride others reserved for family portraits. The albums were often bound in green leather, embossed with gold leaf, and displayed as prominently as fine china. You imagine turning the pages slowly, hearing the faint crackle of dried leaves, and trying not to sneeze in appreciation. Mrs. Talbot speaks of the scandal that year. Miss Eleanor Brightly's Boston fern, transported all the way from Bath, had been suspected of being pre-purchased from a professional gardener. The judges found insufficient evidence to disqualify her, though Mrs. Talbot insists her fronds had a suspiciously metropolitan flair. Historians still debate whether such accusations were born of genuine concern for fair play or were simply the Victorian version of throwing shade. You pour yourself tea, the warmth seeping into your hands. Outside, a faint drizzle blurs the garden. The rhythmic patter against the window glass has the effect of lulling you deeper into the scene, like a soft drum keeping time for the day. From somewhere in the hall, you hear the sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate. Mr. Talbot appears briefly, nodding politely, then vanishes again, perhaps retreating to the study to read about railway timetables or the Boer War. You suspect he finds the fern competitions baffling, and yet you can't help but notice how much care is involved. The way Winifred tilts her head at a plant as if reading its mood. The way the pots are positioned for maximum light but minimal draft. Even the tea feels somehow related, its gentle heat echoing the glasshouse warmth you left behind. You remember the fern in the corner, the champion. Winifred's voice lowers as she hints that Lady Cartwright has been seen making furtive visits to the seed merchant. She sips her tea, her eyes drifting to the rain, as though she's already imagining the next show. The day moves unhurriedly. You lean back, feeling the weight of the chair cushions, the scent of tea and coal mingling in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage passes, its wheels hissing against the wet road. You feel the edges of the story folding around you like a blanket, warm, detailed, and just a little bit ridiculous. You wake the next morning in that little guest room, the one with the wallpaper that's doing its best to look like exotic palms but is really just green ink printed slightly off-center. A sliver of gray light leaks through the lace curtains. It's the kind of light that says, technically, it's daytime, but don't feel pressured to do anything impressive. From the hallway, you hear the clinking of teacups, the muffled laughter of Mrs. Penberry discussing root-rot tragedies with a neighbor. You shuffle to the small writing desk under the window, where an open notebook sits. It's filled with spidery handwriting detailing yesterday's Fern show results, which you definitely don't remember recording. Perhaps you're becoming part of the house, absorbing gossip through the walls like a sponge. Victorian mornings in this part of England start slowly unless you're a milk delivery boy, in which case you've been running since 4 a.m. But for a respectable lady with a fern in the competition, the morning is devoted to inspection rounds. You trail behind Mrs. Penberry into her prized conservatory. The glass is fogged from last night's misting ritual, droplets catching in your hair as you step inside. The air smells of wet soil, lemon soap, and the faint sharpness of fertilizer she pretends is all natural. Here's a fact for you. By the 1870s, the craze for indoor ferns had gotten so intense that entire London streets hosted weekly auctions. Auctioneers shouting bids for Adiantum capillus veneris like it was the hottest stock tip. The most coveted were the larger specimens, kept under precise humidity control in elaborate Wardian cases. One story goes that a young lady in Bath fainted when she lost her bid on a particularly lush Dicksonia antarctica. Whether this is true or a product of gossip with too much tea is, as usual, something historians can't quite agree on. You help Mrs. Penberry adjust a curtain to protect her giant specimen from the harsh angle of sunlight. She mutters about rogue light beams, like they're criminal masterminds. You half expect her to demand the arrest of the afternoon sun. She shows you the newest fern tonic she's ordered by post, pouring a carefully measured teaspoon into a watering can. The label promises exuberant frond confidence. You nod gravely, because what else can you do? And here's your obscure cultural tidbit of the morning. Some Victorian households kept fern diaries, where owners would log frond growth like proud parents tracking a child's first steps. These were often decorated with pressed leaves, neat sketches, and occasionally deeply competitive notes about neighbors' specimens. You imagine Mrs. Penberry's diary has entire chapters dedicated to the downfall of Mrs. Fairley's once mighty Boston fern. A distant church bell chimes. Mrs. Penberry snaps to attention. Today is the day before the big show, which means every leaf must be perfect. She instructs you to polish the Wardian case glass from the inside, which, as you soon discover, involves bending in ways your joints find objectionable. She hums softly while inspecting her plant like a jeweler studying a rare gem. Somewhere in the middle of this, you think back to the street you walked down yesterday, the one with the iron lampposts. You'll pass it again this afternoon on the way to deliver entry papers to the exhibition hall. Mrs. Penberry insists on a hand delivery, because one cannot trust the post with matters of prestige. By midday, you're seated at the kitchen table, your hands smelling faintly of lemon oil and fern sap. A pie cools on the counter. It's not for you. It's for the judges, because, apparently, no respectable victory is won without proper refreshment for the panel. You're beginning to suspect Victorian fern competitions are as much about charm as chlorophyll. Outside, a cart rattles by, its driver singing something about lost love and muddy boots. The air feels heavier now, clouds gathering in a slow, deliberate way, as if the sky wants to be part of the suspense. You take a last look at the giant fern before you head out with Mrs. Penberry. Its fronds sway faintly, though there's no breeze. Maybe it's a trick of your tired eyes. Or maybe the plant is just smug. The walk to the exhibition hall is longer than you expect. Cobblestones shift slightly under your boots, making you aware of muscles you didn't even know you had. The town is dressed for the event, bunting strung between shop fronts, painted signs advertising the grand fern and floral display, 1 shilling entry. Children dart between adults, carrying armfuls of flowers almost as big as themselves. You pass the bakery from yesterday, the smell of cinnamon and rising dough curling through the air like it's trying to lure you back inside. But Mrs. Penberry's stride is purposeful, and you suspect she might physically block the door if you tried to linger. The exhibition hall itself is a cavernous brick building with tall arched windows and a faint echo that makes even polite conversation sound like a public announcement. Inside, the air is warm, thick with the scent of earth, blossoms, and an undertone of, "Was that cabbage?" Yes. Someone has brought ornamental cabbages. Bold choice. A long table near the entrance is staffed by volunteers with clipboards, carefully logging each entrance name, plant species, and distinguishing qualities. You watch as a man describes his terrace critica with the kind of devotion usually reserved for poetry recitals. Mrs. Penberry waits her turn, tapping her entry papers against her palm in a rhythm that suggests mild impatience. Historical fact of the day. In 19th century Britain, Fern societies weren't just casual clubs. They had strict membership rules, annual meetings, and sometimes even dress codes for official functions. One notable society in Manchester once required sober-colored attire to avoid distracting from the greenery on display. And yes, people actually followed it. Your obscure tidbit. Certain rare fern varieties were so prized that wealthy owners hired private fern minders to watch over them during public exhibitions. Their job was simple: stand near the plant, look intimidating, and, if necessary, swat away overly curious fingers. It's hard to imagine someone attempting fern theft, but apparently it happened. Mrs. Penberry finally hands over her papers, receives a neat ticket in return, and turns to you with a conspiratorial smile. Now we scout the competition. You follow her through aisles lined with ferns in every imaginable size and shade. Some are so small they seem shy, hiding in the corners of their pots. Others are vast, spilling over their cases like they might just keep growing forever. There's a low hum of conversation. Traders swapping care tips, competitors pretending not to be sizing each other up. Near the back of the hall, you spot Mrs. Fairley, her Boston fern indeed looking diminished. She greets Mrs. Penberry with a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. The exchange is polite, but you can feel the undercurrent. This is fern politics in action. Mrs. Penberry leans toward you as they part ways. The poor dear's fronds have gone leggy. Happens when one's too generous with the watering can. You nod as though you fully understand this insult. The afternoon light slants in through the high windows, making the air seem dustier, more golden. Somewhere nearby, a small group debates the merits of peat moss versus loam. You pretend to listen but find your attention drifting to the patterns on the floorboards, the gentle shuffle of shoes, the faint rustle of leaves when someone passes too close. By the time you leave, the town is quieter, the bunting fluttering softly in the cooling breeze. You walk past the same lamppost again, its shadow stretching longer now. There's a stillness in the air that makes you think tomorrow, the day of the judging, might just be the slowest, most nerve-wracking day you've ever spent in someone else's century. And honestly, you probably won't make it through without another pot of tea. If you had stepped into the parlor of a fern-loving Victorian woman in those years, you would have felt as if you'd crossed into another world. The air would be warm, but not stifling, and scented faintly of damp soil. A pale shaft of daylight might filter through lace curtains, soften to a gentle glow before touching the fronds. The ferns themselves would stand in ornate pots, majolica, perhaps, or delicately hand-painted china. Some stood tall, with fronds cascading down like emerald waterfalls. Others curled in tight spirals, waiting for the warmth to coax them open. These parlors were not merely decorated, they were sanctuaries, and the women who tended them did so with the devotion of a poet writing by candlelight, each leaf a verse in a living poem. But where ferns thrived, so too did stories. Soon the women began to compare notes. "How long are your fronds this week, Mrs. Whitcomb?" one might ask over tea, the question floating with feigned casualness. Afternoon visits became gentle inspections. A new sprout on one woman's plant could inspire polite admiration, and a flurry of whispered determination among her friends to match it. These were no harsh rivalries. Rather, they were like soft, rolling waves in a quiet harbor, each woman pushing the others forward, gently, with warmth and a hint of playful pride. In parlors and greenhouses, in letters penned across towns, the competition grew not for money, nor for recognition, but for the quiet joy of nurturing something rare and beautiful into its fullest life. The air has turned slightly cooler, though not cold, as you make your way past a narrow side street that looks like it's made entirely for secrets. The cobblestones are so uneven here that you're almost convinced they were laid by someone who'd never seen a straight line in their life. A man in a bowler hat nods politely as he passes, the faint smell of tobacco trailing after him. You adjust your pace, letting the rhythm of your footsteps match the soft, almost imperceptible patter of a fine drizzle that has begun to fall. This part of town is where the fern competitions feel less like polite society's pastime and more like an underground sport. Not in a scandalous way, though wouldn't that make a delightful headline, but in the sense that there's a quiet rivalry humming beneath every conversation. You catch the murmur of two shopkeepers leaning in toward each other, discussing the unusual size of Mrs. Tilbury's Blecknam gibbon. They speak about it the way others might speak of a racehorse. Tonight's notable historical fact comes tucked inside this very street. In 1862, a woman named Eliza Whiteley supposedly cultivated a fern so wide it blocked her front door entirely. She had to climb in and out through the back window for weeks before deciding to trim it down. Whether this is true or not, well, historians still debate whether the anecdote was an actual occurrence or a playful exaggeration that spiraled out of control in the local paper. And then, as you turn a corner, you encounter a tiny tea shop with a window display so charming it's almost rude. A small sign in elegant script invites you to come in from the damp, which you take as both a literal and emotional suggestion. Inside, the warmth hugs you instantly, and a brass kettle whistles softly from behind the counter. The scent of bergamot tea wraps itself around you as the shopkeeper pours you a cup, sliding over a saucer that has the faint pattern of ferns etched into the glaze. You sip slowly, the heat curling pleasantly through you. On the shelf behind the counter, you notice a stack of hand-bound gardening journals. Some are marked with delicate tags. Recipes for fern tonics, shade placement theory, and, intriguingly, the fern's emotional needs. You resist the urge to ask about the last one, though you make a mental note to find out later. By the time you finish your tea, the rain outside has softened into mist, and the street glows in the gaslight like it's been gently brushed with gold. You step back outside, a little lighter, a little warmer, and with the quiet certainty that the next corner might hold something even stranger. You follow the curve of the road until you find yourself in front of a wrought iron gate that hums with the quiet authority of "this is important." The gate is ajar, which feels like an unspoken invitation, and you slip inside. Beyond it lies the communal fern conservatory, less a building and more a cathedral of glass and green. The roof arches high overhead, mist curling upward into the rafters. Fern fronds spill from every direction, brushing against your shoulders as if they've been waiting for you. Here the air feels alive, damp, cool, and carrying that unmistakable scent of earth after rain. Somewhere, water trickles faintly into a stone basin, and the sound is so steady it could lull even the busiest mind into stillness. You notice a row of plaques along one wall, each engraved with the name of a previous fern champion. Some names are familiar from whispered street gossip. Others feel like they belong in an entirely different century. Tonight's obscure cultural tidbit emerges here. During the height of Victorian fern fever, there were actually etiquette rules for viewing someone's prized plant. You were expected to stand at a respectful distance, avoid breathing too closely, and under no circumstances were you to touch the fronds. Doing so could result in a sharp gasp from the host and a swift ushering toward the exit. This rule, it seems, is still being honored in the way visitors keep their hands politely folded behind their backs. As you walk deeper inside, you catch sight of a woman in a long green velvet gown. Her hair pinned up in a way that makes her look like she stepped straight out of a portrait. She's inspecting a particularly lush specimen, murmuring encouragement under her breath. For a moment, you wonder whether she's speaking to the fern or to herself. One corner of the conservatory is dedicated to ferns in unusual vessels. You see them sprouting from teapots, woven baskets, even a hollowed-out leather boot. Each display has a small card describing its origin story, though some of the tales sound suspiciously like they've been embellished. Grown from a single spore carried on the wind from the Scottish Highlands, one reads. Another claims, this fern survived 3 relocations, 1 mild scandal, and a house fire without so much as a browned leaf. You wander slowly, letting the green hush sink into you, the world outside fading until it feels like you've been here for hours, or possibly days. And then, just as you're about to leave, you spot something small but magnetic. A glass jar on a pedestal, containing a single, perfectly curled fern frond. The label beneath it simply says, "The Beginning." It's a little dramatic, perhaps, but you like it. Among the fern-growing circles, there were whispers of recipes, not for soup or pudding, but for soil. Mrs. Larkspur swore by a pinch of powdered charcoal to keep the roots healthy. Mrs. Pennington insisted on soaking the fronds in dew gathered at dawn. Never rainwater, never tap. And there were stranger methods still. A few claimed their ferns responded to quiet music played on the pianoforte in the afternoons. One woman read poetry aloud to hers, convinced that the gentle rhythm of the words encouraged each leaf to unfurl just a little wider. These secrets were shared in half-laughing confidence, often accompanied by the warning, Don't tell Mrs. Whitcomb. She'll have the largest in town by spring. It was all part of the charm. A quilt of small rituals and tender experiments, stitched together with friendship. On rare and special afternoons, some women would invite a small gathering to view their ferns in what they playfully called exhibitions. Tables would be covered in crisp white cloths, upon which the ferns stood like honored guests. A silver tray of lemon biscuits and steaming cups of tea would be ready nearby. Visitors leaned in close to admire the patterns. Each frond a green lacework, each curl a secret kept by nature. Gasps of delight rose now and then. "Oh, I've never seen one so tall." It was as though each fern had a personality, shy, dramatic, regal, or quietly elegant. The exhibitions never drew large crowds, nor did they seek to. They were private celebrations, shared among those who understood the slow, patient joy of coaxing life from soil. The morning light falls through the window in long, pale ribbons, as though the sun is still too shy to fully commit. You're up earlier than you planned, partly because the neighbor's milk cart rattled past with all the subtlety of a small earthquake, and partly because, well, your brain likes to greet the day whether you approve or not. Pot of tea sits on the table, still steaming. It smells faintly of bergamot, but mostly of the faint dust from yesterday's over-enthusiastic stoking of the fireplace. Today you're off to see Miss Weatherby, one of the district's undisputed queens of fern culture. Her greenhouse is less a building and more a temple, glass walls, ornate ironwork arches, and a faint mist in the air that makes everything look like it belongs in some hazy Victorian watercolor. She greets you in a dress the color of tea with too much milk, wearing gloves so spotless you wonder if they've ever met actual soil. Inside, the ferns are spectacular. Arching fronds, deep green frills, some leaves long enough to be mistaken for exotic banners. You run your fingers lightly over one, feeling its feathered edges, like soft lace woven by nature itself. She tells you about the Pteridamania that swept through England in the mid-1800s, a real historical craze for collecting, cultivating, and displaying ferns. People kept them in glass cases indoors called Wardian cases to maintain perfect humidity. These weren't just plants. They were status symbols, the Victorian equivalent of a limited edition smartphone. One obscure tidbit she shares: some households would even decorate dinner tables with miniature ferns in tiny glass domes, just so guests could admire their domesticated wilderness between spoonfuls of soup. Apparently, nothing says bon appetit like an imprisoned shrub. You notice one fern in her collection looks oddly unfamiliar. She leans closer, almost conspiratorially, and says historians still debate whether this particular species ever actually grew in England, or if it was just a clever import passed off as native. The mystery makes it more precious in her eyes. She offers you a small cutting in a damp cloth wrap, an unspoken invitation to join the leafy rivalry. As you step outside, you realize the air feels a little cooler, but the sunlight has grown more confident. You clutch the fern like a secret you're not sure you can keep. Somewhere behind you, a rival gardener probably sneezed. Coincidence? Maybe not. You decide to walk back through the cobblestone lanes instead of taking the main road. There's a soft drizzle now. Not enough for an umbrella, just enough to beat up on your sleeves and blur the outlines of chimneys above. You pass the street you walked past on your first morning here. Remember that one? with the bakery that smelled so good you nearly adopted bread as a new religion, still smells the same. A pair of boys run past, holding something between them that looks suspiciously like a fern pot swaddled in a blanket. You raise an eyebrow, but in this town, plant-related heists are probably considered a respectable sport. Back at your lodging, you place Miss Weatherby's fern cutting near the window, right beside your slowly reviving potted maidenhair fern. You can almost hear the two exchanging polite, leafy greetings, like Victorian ladies at a tea party sizing each other up while pretending to admire the biscuits. That afternoon, you're invited to a garden circle meeting. Imagine a book club, but replace novels with soil samples and gossip about plot twists with gossip about compost ratios. A gentleman in a stiff collar recites a recent newspaper clipping about a rare fern supposedly spotted in a Cornish cave. The group murmurs with interest, though one woman whispers that such reports are often embellished to attract tourists. An actual historical fact slips into the conversation. In 1864, a prize-winning specimen of Cyathea dilbata, a silver fern, was displayed in London, drawing crowds who queued for hours just to see it under glass. Not unlike queuing for a famous painting, but with more ferns and fewer security guards. An obscure tidbit emerges. One eccentric collector in Devon reportedly hired a housemaid whose sole job was to lightly dust the fern leaves every morning with a squirrel tail brush. The group treats this as perfectly reasonable. By the time the meeting ends, dusk has settled. The air smells faintly of rain and coal smoke, a strangely comforting combination. You head back, noticing the lamplighter making his rounds, tipping his cap as he passes. Your fern waits on the sill, its fronds already slightly unfurling, as if stretching into its new home. You imagine it whispering about tomorrow's weather or quietly judging your watering technique. Both seem plausible. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you suspect you're in deeper than you meant to be. And yet, you're fine with that. It's a Thursday afternoon, or at least you think it is. In Victorian England, days have a way of blending together, especially when the main source of drama in your life is the rate at which a frond unfurls. You stand at the window, teacup in hand, watching Mrs. Fairchild across the road. She's carrying something wrapped in damp muslin. Probably another fern rhizome she's convinced will outshine yours. She waves cheerily, but it's the kind of wave that says, "Good luck catching up, darling." Inside, the air is warm and slightly humid, just the way your ferns like it. You've even placed shallow bowls of water near the coal grate to release steam as the fire burns. It makes your parlor smell faintly like wet stone and overripe apples, comforting in a strange way. Today's big task is rearranging the ferns so they each get just the right amount of indirect light. This involves a complicated rotation system you've invented, which you suspect no one else in the world has the patience for. Some people have waltzes and travel. You have spreadsheet-like mental maps of fern placement. The historical fact for today drifts in like steam. By the mid-19th century, Britain had imported over 1,000 fern species, many from far-flung colonies, and fern hunting was a fashionable, if slightly dangerous, hobby for the upper classes. Imagine risking snakebite or malaria just to bring home a leaf. The Victorians didn't so much collect plants as they conquered them. Obscure tidbit. Some especially proud fern enthusiasts mounted fronds behind glass and hung them on their walls, like botanical trophies. You've considered it, but somehow it feels like turning a living friend into wallpaper. Historians still debate whether this level of fern devotion was driven more by genuine botanical curiosity or by a desire to subtly show off one's colonial reach without saying a word. You spend the afternoon dusting each leaf with the corner of a soft cotton handkerchief. You talk to them as you work, whispering things like, "You're doing splendidly," and "Don't let Mrs. Fairchild's polypodium intimidate you." At one point, you catch yourself wondering if the ferns talk back when you're asleep. If they do, you hope it's not about your tendency to overwater. By the time evening comes, the room glows gold, the ferns casting intricate shadows across the wallpaper. You feel victorious, if not in the contest, then at least in the quiet battle to keep something alive and green in a soot-covered city. You probably won't make it through the night without dreaming of fronds. The next morning smells of damp soil and toast. It's the sort of day when the sky can't quite decide if it's committed to sunshine or rain, so it offers both in polite alternation. You venture into the garden, a narrow stretch of earth fenced in by brick and stubborn ivy. The outdoor air feels brisk compared to the fern-humidified coziness inside. You kneel down to inspect the maidenhair fern you've been coaxing back to health for months. It's finally sent up a new frond, delicate, trembling slightly in the breeze. You find yourself oddly moved, as though it's a small green flag of loyalty. Today's historical fact unfurls. Fern fever, or Turritomania, as it was dramatically called, peaked around the 1850s and 60s. The craze was so widespread that fern motifs appeared on everything from teacups to gravestones. In other words, even in death, Victorians wanted to be stylishly leafy. The obscure tidbit is one of your favorites. Some households built miniature, table-sized greenhouses called Wardian cases to keep ferns alive in the sooty city air. They were, in a sense, the Victorian version of terrariums and, if we're honest, an early form of showing off to guests without seeming too obvious about it. Historians still debate whether Wardian cases were more about plant preservation or about signaling a refined, scientifically literate household. You suspect it was both. You carry the new frond inside and position it in pride of place near the front window. The whole act feels ceremonial, as though you've just crowned it champion. Midday brings Mrs. Fairchild to your door again, this time bearing a cutting as a friendly gesture. You accept it, knowing full well she's testing whether your growing skills extend to her territory. There's a slow, quiet joy in imagining her disappointment when it thrives. By evening, you've settled into your armchair, cup of tea in hand, watching the last sunlight fade through fern leaves. Their silhouettes sway slightly, as if bowing in approval. Somewhere beyond the gaslit streets, trains carry more ferns into London. Rare ones, strange ones, delicate ones. But for now, the room is still, and the only thing moving is the slow stretch of green toward tomorrow. The evening air is cool now, and the great glasshouse smells faintly of damp moss and that particular mineral scent that comes from clay pots stacked along the side wall. You stand here among the ferns, taller now than some of the people who tend them, and you realize that, if anyone had told you 6 months ago you'd be emotionally invested in the circumference of a frond, you'd have laughed. But here you are, utterly devoted. You run a hand lightly along the underside of a leaf, feeling the gentle ridges. It's the sort of tactile moment that seems to stretch time, soft, patient, unhurried. The kind of moment your mind files under perfectly useless, yet perfect. Somewhere in the far corner, Mrs. Hawthorne is holding court, her voice lowered to that conspiratorial hush she uses when relaying what she insists are absolute certainties about plant nutrition. She is explaining, for the third time this week, her theory that if you play the pianoforte to a fern every Thursday afternoon, it will grow exactly 3 inches taller in a month. Of course, she adds, only Chopin will do. Beethoven is too robust. You are not entirely sure if she's joking, or if the ferns can actually tell the difference. Historians still debate whether Victorian plant owners really believed in such acoustic horticulture, or whether it was simply another excuse to play the piano badly in polite company. The soft clinking of a watering can being set down punctuates the air, and you notice Mr. Peters quietly retreating after delivering fresh water to each pot. He doesn't linger for conversation. He never does. His love for the plants is silent, devoted, and, you suspect, slightly competitive. He keeps a private notebook of growth measurements tucked into his coat pocket, written in tiny, meticulous script. You've caught glimpses of it, columns of dates and inches, little sketches of frond shape, and although he pretends it's just to keep track, there's a gleam in his eye when one of his specimens overtakes another in size. Outside, a thin mist begins to gather, curling around the lanterns hung by the garden path. Their glow is warm, softened by the fog, making the path look like something from a half-forgotten painting. You step out for a moment, breathing in the chill and letting it fill your lungs. Somewhere, a carriage passes, its wheels whispering over wet cobblestones, and the world feels both infinite and very, very small. By the time you step back inside, Mrs. Hawthorne's lecture has turned into a gentle lull, the kind of voice that could easily be mistaken for a bedtime story. Perhaps that's why the ferns seem so still, so patient, as if they, too, are listening. And perhaps you think with a quiet smile they are. Morning arrives with the lightest drizzle, the kind that dusts everything with a sheen rather than soaking it. You wake to the faint smell of coal fires starting in neighboring houses, and the muffled shuffle of footsteps outside. Someone delivering the day's milk in glass bottles that clink just loud enough to puncture the dream you were having about ferns wearing little Victorian bonnets. You're not sure if that was charming or unsettling. Stepping into the fern room at this hour feels different. The light is pale and diffused, filtering through condensation-slicked panes of glass. The air is cool, and each breath seems to carry the scent of earth more deeply into you. The ferns themselves stand in their quiet ranks, some in massive urns, others in hanging baskets that sway slightly from the early morning draft. Dew beads on their leaves, tiny worlds reflecting the softened daylight. Mrs. Chalmers is already there, arranging moss at the base of her prized specimen with the care of someone tucking a child into bed. She glances up and says, "They drink in the morning light better than they do in the afternoon, you know." Whether or not that's true, you find yourself nodding. Victorian plant care often teetered between sound horticultural practice and pure whimsy. It was, after all, an age where one might be advised to read poetry aloud to a sickly potted fern, because it responds to the tenderness of verse. On a side table, a fresh delivery of plant catalogs waits to be opened, crisp pages promising exotic species from faraway colonies. Each glossy illustration is a siren call to competitive gardeners. New shapes, new textures, new chances to outdo the neighbor's glasshouse by springtime. You leaf through them slowly, the smell of ink and paper mingling with the loamy scent of the room. One lithograph catches your eye. A fern from New Zealand, fronds curling like question marks, the caption declaring it most suitable for indoor cultivation if treated with proper civility. You almost laugh. Proper civility for a fern. Rain begins to patter more insistently against the roof, and the sound joins the faint ticking of the wall clock. The occasional drip from a watering can left slightly ajar. It's all so hypnotic that you lean against the wooden bench, letting your eyes wander. Somewhere in this world of green and mist and soft rivalry, entire friendships and quiet feuds are growing alongside the plants. It's an oddly comforting thought. And as the room fills with the smell of damp soil and rain, you feel the same slow contentment you've felt for weeks now. That gentle certainty that you are exactly where you're meant to be, in a world where the only real urgency is how quickly a frond might unfurl. You wake to the kind of morning that feels like it's been quietly humming for hours before you arrived in it. The light outside is gentle, filtered through a damp mist that settled across the village like a soft blanket. Even the rooks in the elm trees seem to be speaking in muffled voices, as if they, too, have signed an unspoken agreement not to disturb the calm. The cottage smells faintly of yesterday's tea leaves and the damp moss you tracked in last night. A wool shawl slips from your shoulder as you shuffle to the window, and there it is, your fern, the one you've been coaxing into near-mythical proportions. The leaves are beaded with dew, each droplet catching a stray flicker of light. You could swear the fronds look bigger today, though you remind yourself that plant growth is not supposed to be quite this thrilling. Outside, Mrs. Penworthy passes with her wheelbarrow full of compost, her contribution to the unspoken but ever-present friendly rivalry. She nods to you in that suspiciously polite way that says she has measured her fern that morning and found it satisfactory. Somewhere behind her, someone's rooster crows, not as a wake-up call, but as a mild declaration of superiority. Historically speaking, this was the late 19th century heyday for ornamental plant competitions. Britain's fern craze, known as Turritomania, was so widespread that even small hamlets like yours would host seasonal displays, complete with measuring sticks, water misters, and rules so specific they'd make a modern gardening club blush. And yes, historians still debate whether these competitions were truly about horticulture, or just an excuse to parade one's social refinement under the guise of soil pH discussions. You put on your boots and step outside, the air cool and a little sticky against your skin. The lane is quieter than usual. Somewhere down the row of cottages, a laugh echoes. The sort of laugh that tells you something is afoot, or more accurately, AF Fern. You immediately regret thinking that pun, but it's too late. It's in your head now. The day stretches ahead, and you probably won't make it through without at least 3 casual conversations about frond diameter. But you don't mind. Not really. By midday, the clouds have thinned into streaky ribbons, letting the sunlight scatter in golden shards across the hedgerows. You're sitting at the long oak table in the village hall, the unofficial headquarters for fern diplomacy. Cups of weak tea steam gently in front of everyone, their scent mingling with the faintly musty aroma of pressed flower scrapbooks stacked in the corner. The conversation circles lazily around topics that might seem absurdly narrow to an outsider. How often to rotate a potted fern in uneven light, whether rainwater or well water yields better fronds, and, in Mrs. Penworthy's case, whether singing to plants actually works. She swears it does, but notably avoids revealing what songs she uses. Your own contribution is to mention that your fern survived a small slug incursion last week, earning you a few impressed murmurs and one conspiratorial wink from Mr. Harcourt, who has been quietly rooting for you all season. A ledger sits open on the table, containing the official competition measurements from past years. You trail your fingers over the neat copperplate handwriting, entries going back decades, each one a quiet testament to the slow, steady obsession of generations. Somewhere near the bottom of a page from 1874 is an odd note. Frond of exceptional curl, disqualified for exceeding standard spiral allowance. The existence of such a rule is a surprise to you, though perhaps not to anyone who's been here long enough to remember the spiral scandal of '73. A knock at the door interrupts the murmured debates. It's young Thomas from the post office, bringing word that a visiting judge from London will be arriving early for this year's display. The room stills, then hums again with the subdued thrill of impending evaluation. There's something about an outsider's gaze that makes even the most confident fern grower recheck their watering schedule. As you leave the hall, the sunlight has shifted again, painting your lane in warm honey tones. You glance toward your fern and feel that quiet tug of both pride and apprehension, because tomorrow, the stakes will be just a little higher, and the fronds, well, they seem to know it too. The morning of the final judging dawns under a sky the color of steeped chamomile. A fine mist hangs over Fernford, softening every edge until even the brick chimneys look like they've been dusted with down. You make your way toward the great hall, the sound of your footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones. Inside, rows of ferns stand like silent contestants in a pageant, each one poised, impossibly green, and glistening faintly as if they've been whispering encouragement to each other in the early hours. Mrs. Harcourt's plant greets you like an old friend, its fronds leaning ever so slightly toward your presence, while Mrs. Calloway's giant beauty seems to command the light itself, drawing the gaze of everyone in the room. Today's quiet historical note. In Victorian judging, it wasn't only the size of the fern that mattered. Judges considered symmetry, leaf texture, and even grace of bearing, an oddly poetic phrase for something rooted in soil. The fern, in essence, had to look like it knew how to be a fern. The judges moved slowly from plant to plant, clipboards in hand, pausing now and then to peer closely at a single frond tip, or to trace a finger along the rib of a leaf. Conversations hush whenever they draw near, then resume in carefully modulated whispers as soon as they pass. Time stretches. The air is thick with the faint perfume of damp greenery and anticipation. Evening settles gently over Fernford as the results are announced. There is applause, polite but warm, when Mrs. Harcourt is awarded second place, her smile serene, her hand resting protectively on her fern's pot as though thanking it for the effort. Mrs. Calloway takes the prize for largest specimen, though the judges note it was a competition of inches. And then something unexpected. An honorary ribbon is given to most cherished fern, a category invented on the spot. It goes to a plant tended by a young girl at the edge of the village, a modest little thing compared to the giants, but clearly adored. The room melts into gentle laughter, the kind that carries no sting. Outside, the lamps glow gold against the mist, and the air smells of turned earth and tea leaves. You walk home slowly, past gardens now sleeping under the dim light, the outlines of ferns still visible in their pots. Your last historical whisper for tonight. Some of those Victorian ferns still survive, passed down through generations like heirlooms, fronds unfurling long after their original caretakers were gone. And perhaps, somewhere in a quiet English garden, one of Mrs. Harcourt's descendants still grows, leaning toward the morning sun, dreaming of competitions past. You close the door behind you, kettle warming on the stove, the day's green memories still wrapped gently around your thoughts. And as you drift toward sleep, you feel it soft and steady, like the growth of a fern you can't quite see, but somehow know is there. The garden is quiet now. Even the ferns seem to have sighed themselves into stillness, their fronds folded into the night like green lace curtains drawn against the cool air. The lamps along the path give off their last faint flickers, little amber halos in the dark, while somewhere far off, a teacup clinks and then nothing. Only the sound of the world breathing slowly. You walk back through the lane where we began. Remember the cobblestones? They're still uneven, though your footsteps are softer now, almost part of the shadows. The air smells of damp earth and a little wood smoke, as if the town has tucked itself in for the evening. Somewhere in the darkness, the river moves without hurry, a silken thread weaving its way toward tomorrow. You can't see it, but you can feel the cool pull of its presence. The same way you can still feel the story, how hands once coaxed impossible life from the soil, how ladies in lace gloves and stubborn hearts quietly made history, one fern at a time. There's no competition now, no ribbons, no judges. Only the memory of green things growing, and the strange, gentle pride they carried. The stars overhead are pale and soft, like chalk dust scattered across velvet. You could count them, but you don't need to. They will still be there when you wake. And so the night deepens, and the streets empty, and the last door closes somewhere down the road. It's all right to set this day down. Let the ferns keep their watch. Let the garden grow without you for a while. And let yourself drift, slowly, into the deep and quiet green.